heart, speech, and actions. Our hearts, and we talked about that last night, that our hearts has to be upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, because we will be questioned about this. And last night we talked about the subject of a nasiha, that a Muslim has the concern towards other Muslims, that the Muslim have that sincerity towards one another. Only Allah knows what's in the hearts. And the Prophet ﷺ would give the pledge of al-Islam when someone embraces the deen of Allah after saying La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah wa nush li kulli Muslim. To have the concern towards every Muslim, not just the one that sits next to you or in your community, but the entire ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is the aqd of al-Iman, this is the covenant of al-Iman. And with all different actions that's supposed to be done with the heart. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you shall believe, complete his iman, till he love for his brother what he love for himself. This is a deed done by the heart. It shows in speech and actions, but its place is in the heart. Right? So all of these meanings has to be there. And then when it comes to the speech and actions, we are still commanded to choose what we say, to make sure that that brings all kinds of goodness as a result of what's in the heart, and also to watch our physical actions, to observe the rights of one another. Because of the time, in Surah Al-Hujurat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned all the different levels of manners. There's the manners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله. Do not go forward, do not make any decision, do not do anything before you get to know the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's bad manners with Allah. We always, and forgive me if I'm repeating if you were present before, but it's all lead to one another. If you, as a Muslim, been always hearing that we need to be obedient to Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is the foundation of the religion. But the ayah in Surah Al-Hujurat is beyond that already well-known established principle in the deen. It's not just being obedient, it's about not saying, not making a decision, not making a ruling before you get to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you. And this is a way of life. For example, if you moved somewhere, if you hired for a job, if you got married, whatever decisions that you make, major or minor in your life, you do it, and then, is it good or bad? Is it halal, haram? That's bad manners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's against the adab ma'allah. The adab, the manners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that before you do anything, you want to know if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with it or not. You know that it's halal or haram. If it's halal, is there more than one choice than this? If it's haram, you stay away from it. If it's even something that is from al-mubahat, permissible actions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislated for us to do what? Salatul istikhara. To make Salatul istikhara, not to make salah or not, this is obvious. Salatul istikhara for the permissible things, whether to attend this or not, whether to get married to that person or not, things that is not sinful to start with. You already dealt with the halal and the haram, you get to know that this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permit for you to do, and still with the manners of Allah, you make Salatul istikhara. And the Prophet ﷺ would teach the Sahaba radiallahu anhum al-istikhara fil umuri kulliha, in all of their affairs, in every matter. Because you pray sunnah, so Salatul istikhara is rak'atayn min dun al-farida. Any two rak'ah other than the fard. Sunnatul fajr, sunnatul dhuhr, tahiyyatul masjid, any night prayer. So, and we're making decisions all the time, and never to belittle anything, because everything is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, the manners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the manners with the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is mentioned as a foundation also of the deen in the surah. The manners with the fasiq, as the ayah talks about, in ja'akum fasiqum binaba. Right? If a fasiq, whether it's in the original meaning of it, a sinner, someone that doesn't really care about what's halal and what's haram, or any individual, so the etiquettes of how to deal with someone in that state, the manners that has to do with the believers, those who you acquaint yourself with, and the manners of the believers in large, the manners towards mankind, all of that is mentioned as principles in the surah. Then the details is in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, practically perfectly done by the Prophet ﷺ and the companions radiallahu anhu. Also last night we mentioned إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً in the surah. The believers are indeed ikhwah, brothers. We talk about brotherhood and we need to establish the rights of being brothers physically and non-physically with our hearts. But one of the things that is very unique to this verse is that al-ukhuwa or brotherhood in the deen of al-Islam is part of al-Iman. إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةً. So if you want to establish the ukhuwa, you have to establish al-Iman. Because without brotherhood, that means there is deficiency and issues with one's Iman, with one's faith. And if there are issues in one's Iman and one's faith, there are issues in the ukhuwa. So there's no need for us to invent anything. So if we see that the brotherhood among ourselves or whatever is not according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, so that means there's ilm, knowledge that we need to learn. What is really the definition of it? How to be truly a brother for a Muslim brother, whether you know him or you don't know him. All the different relationships in our life, that is included, it's mentioned perfectly in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So we have to learn that. We have to take the time where we learn what are the rights of our brothers, the close one, the farther away from us, and so on. So once we get that ilm, that knowledge, then we have to implement it. And if it's not implemented according to the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, if we don't see ourselves as the Sahaba radiallahu anhum used to be with one another, this is not fairy tales. When we are commanded to follow the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, this is in every aspect of our life. And where is that? In the Quran. وَالسَّابِقُونَ الْأَوَّلُونَ مِنَ الْمُهَاجِرِينَ وَالْأَنصَارِ وَالَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُم بِإِحْسَانٍ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. If you want to be among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with, and you're pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then these are the three categories of the ummah. The foremost of the muhajirin, those who migrated from Mecca to Al-Madinah, the Ansar, the people of Al-Madinah, and the third category, which is spacious enough for the entire ummah to be in, but it requires work. وَالَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُم بِإِحْسَانٍ. Those who followed them with ihsan, with goodness. So following who? The muhajirin and the ansar. With ihsan, not just to say we follow them, we love them. Where is the ihsan? The goodness that we follow them in every aspect, in their belief, in their ibadah, in their akhlaq, in how they interacted with one another. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they were not sinless. They committed sins, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was pleased with them. They repented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The revelation will come and change their life. They were not from the first instant perfected. You know, the wahy would come down correcting them. And once they are corrected, they're steadfast for the rest of their life upon this. You know, there are many incidents. For example, when Abu Dharr radiallahu anhu, when the Prophet ﷺ said to him, إِنَّكَ مْرُؤٌ فِيكَ جَاهِلِيَّةٌ. It's a statement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained for it to stay till today, for us to learn. A simple incident, something very, we might consider it insignificant in our life if it happens. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it established in the deen for us to learn. When he had a servant, or not a servant as the other narrations, when he had a dispute. And it was said to be Bilal radiallahu anhu or someone else. So, out of anger, he said to him a statement, Yabna Sawda, the son of the black lady, or something like this. You know, just a word that is being said. And when the Prophet ﷺ got to know that, he said to Abu Dharr, إِنَّكَ مْرُؤٌ فِيكَ جَاهِلِيَّةٌ. You are a man that has jahiliyyah in you, has ignorance in you, still from the days of jahiliyyah. So was that something that he was stigmatized by, if it's correct to say that word, for the rest of his life? Or he did an act of ignorance, and that's Abu Dharr radiallahu anhu. What happened to Abu Dharr radiallahu anhu? Immediately he changed. Nowadays, if someone says something, the grudges will be in the heart forever. That person is this and that, and maybe that person won't change that easy. they had the means by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to change what's in their hearts immediately. If this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid, that means it's forbidden forever. And that's why after the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, Abu Dharr radiallahu anhu will continue to remember this. And before that, when he put his head on the ground and said to him to step on him and asked him for forgiveness, but he would make sure that they would see him with his, if he has a servant, his servant, you would not be able to differentiate him between him and Abu Dharr, wearing the same clothing and treated the same way and so on. All of that is because of that statement of the Prophet ﷺ. So when we follow their example, and this is a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because this has to do something with al-iman. إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ. So when we establish al-iman, the ukhuwah will come. And if there is issues with our brotherhood, that means we have issues with our iman. And al-iman, as we know, the belief of Ahl Sunnah, increases and decreases. Increases with the good deeds and decreases with the bad deeds. So if we commit sins and we don't repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that means the iman is weak. If the iman is weak, what happens to the ukhuwah? Becomes weak also. It goes together. That means when it's weak, that means there's issues, grounds for disputes and problems and so on. And we deal with these problems and these issues, and we forget about why this is happening. And it's happening because of the weakness in the iman. So if we get together and we all make a covenant, an agreement, that we will treat ourselves perfectly, inshallah ta'ala, from now on, till we depart from this life, you won't be able to make it. Unless you establish al-iman. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, لَوْ أَنفَقْتَ مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا مَا أَلَّفْتَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِهِمْ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ أَلَّفَ بَيْنَهُمْ. If you spend all the wealth on the face of earth, you won't be able to bring their hearts together. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ أَلَّفَ بَيْنَهُمْ. But rather, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that brought their hearts together. And allaf is when you bring two things right with one another. That's why they call when you make ta'lif of a book, that means what? You compile the book. It's all one thing, one structure. So this is how the brothers are. مثل المؤمنين في توادهم وتراحمهم وتعاطفهم كمثل الجسد إذا اشتكى منه عضو تداعى له سائر الجسد بالسهر والحمى. That's the hadith of the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. We mentioned that also last night, that the example, the parable of the believers in their showing their love to one another, having the mercy towards one another, having the compassion towards one another, is like one physical human body. If one part of it suffers or in pain, the rest of the body will be also suffering with lack of sleep and fever and so on. You don't say blaming that finger, why is it's in pain? You know, why you're bothering me? Right? Your finger is yourself. You don't consider that your finger or your head or your arm is a separate entity. It's the same thing. It's you. And there's no exaggerations in the examples of the Prophet ﷺ. This is part of the covenant of Al-Iman, that we understand things the way it was revealed. So the Prophet ﷺ said this is how the believers are. Then we have a major problem when we consider ourselves not one. We are like exactly one body, the entire ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. This is by the statement of the Prophet ﷺ. And the same thing, if you pay attention, how wordings of the Quran are in such a way. In Surah Al-Hujurat, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا يَسْخَرْ قَوْمٌ مِّنْ قَوْمٍ عَسَىٰ أَن يَكُونُوا خَيْرًا مِّنْهُمْ ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكون خيرا منهن ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب. تلمزوا اللمز بالقول, as they say, والهمز بالفعل. اللمز is when you say something, even if it's not even a complete word, that would imply that you're ridiculing your brother, that you're belittling him. This is a lams. And it can be even with a gesture of your face. You know, if, for example, a name of a brother is mentioned. What's your name? What's your name? You. Still too early. If, for example, Hassan is mentioned. Where's Hassan? Someone would, roll his eyes or something like this. This is a major thing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is not a simple thing. This is not just a movement and it's over with and we move on to the next statement. No, this is something أمرها عظيم عند الله. This is mentioned in the Quran. ويل لكل همزة لمزة. Right? الهمزة with الفعل. Blinking your eyes, rolling your eyes, saying sometimes even in the subject of al-ghiba. If you say about someone that is not present, where is so and so, in Fajr he didn't come, and then someone say, ربنا يهدينا ويهدي. May Allah guide us and guide him. What did you understand from this? That means he's not really doing well in his deen. That's ghiba to this brother. This is not a minor issue. Unless a person, there's another reason why you say this, you want to go advise him, you want to get together because of the concern towards him. But just to belittle an individual like this, a believer, this is something that is haram, and it comes into the categories of al-ghiba or al-tanabuz bil-alqab, which is something else. But the point here, the Quran mentioned that do not do that to yourself. That means we're one. لا تقتلوا أنفسكم. Do not kill yourself. And it's not in the context of killing yourself. No, killing others is killing yourself, because this is one ummah. Right? So, therefore, to understand this concept, even though you don't see yourself as physically mixed with others, but this is the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, what are we commanded to do with the commands of Allah is to submit ourselves. So now we change the way that we look at things. When it comes to manners, when you say something, when you do something, you are doing that to your own self. You're hurting your own self, because this is one ummah. And this is not just in one masjid, but the entire ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, there's many different categories, and the believers, those who show strength in their iman, they're different than those who are rebellious against the orders of Allah. But the nasiha and the goodness is present at all times to everyone. So the ayat in Surah Al-Hujurat, and I won't exceed half an hour inshallah ta'ala, but we need to learn how to stay away from السخرية. يا الذين آمنوا لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم. Do not make mockery of one another. Maybe the latter is better than the former. But السخرية, you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala سخر لكم ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala سخر for you what's in the heavens and the earth. Is when something is brought to you and يساق الأمر لغرض قهرا, as they say. When something is being dragged for you under a higher power. Right? The heavens and the earth is a creation of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it for you. The sun would not refuse to rise. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it for you. It does not have a choice. So this is a taskhir. So the same word, the root of it is used for لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى يكونوا خيرا منهم. Do not ridicule one another. What happens when you ridicule your brother? You're basically humiliating him. That means you're stating that I'm superior than him, I'm better than him. Some people, the only way for them to be good, or they think that they're good, they have to step on someone to be higher. You don't have to step on people for people to see you that you're higher, right? We need to do that with our actions. So that's why the sukhriya, making mockery, belittling one another, it's a major sin. And since the ayah says, عَسَى يَكُونُ خَيْرًا مِنْهُمْ, maybe that they are better than you, don't say, no, I know the brother very well. He's not better than me. No, the ayah says otherwise. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Whether it's at this immediate time that we're in or at the end of life. Allah knows best who's going to change and who's going to die in what state. Right? So the ayat, and there's details in this. And then also the women are mentioned, even though the khitab, if the ayat addressing men, women are included by default. And if women are mentioned specifically, then maybe this is specific for women. But when both men or women are mentioned, and this is repeated throughout the Quran, there is an extra reason for this to be stated. That means this is a very stressed command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that everyone needs to be reminded. You know, when you say, brothers, we need to be kind to each other. and then you start going one by one. Do you understand what is being said? And the same thing for women. This is one of the things that they can fall easily into the sin of making, ridiculing one another, belittling one another, and never to belittle a word of mouth, as we said. And وَلَا تَنَابَزُوا بِالْأَلْقَابِ, and do not call one another names, whether this is the son of this or this person of this. Anything that a person would dislike is forbidden. And al-ghiba is mentioned in the verses, right? وَلَا يَغْتَبْ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا, do not make ghiba to another. This by itself is a lesson by itself. Al-ghiba, this is one of the easiest sins for a person to commit, while we think it's okay many times. And the Prophet ﷺ defined it, ذِكْرُكَ أَخَاكَ بِمَا يَكْرَهُ, when you mention your brother with something that he dislikes. And they said to the Prophet ﷺ, أَرَأَيْتَ إِنْ كَانَ فِي أَخِي مَا أَقُولُ, O Prophet of Allah, if what my brother has, what I said, I'm not lying, he's this, exactly as I'm saying. Whether it's in his actions, he's greedy, he's this or that, he's too tall, he's too short, something that he disliked for you to say something about him. And it's true. He said, إِن كَانَ فِي أَخِيكَ مَا تَقُولُ فَقَدْ اغْتَبْتَ. If he has what you said, you already established the ghiba upon him. That means you committed a major sin. If he doesn't have what you're saying, فَقَدْ بَهَتَّ. Al-buhtan is even worse of an evil. So the ghiba is there if a person mentions his brother with something that he has. You're not lying whatsoever. Oftentimes you would find people saying this. So a brother is mentioned in a negative way. Brother, this is ghiba, it's not permissible. But I'm not lying. I can say that in his face. You can go say that to his face, but when he's not present, and even some said when he's present, it's not permissible to say that. He is your brother. And this is, again, you don't say that about yourself. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade it. And there are so much details on this. Oftentimes we learn the exceptions to the ghiba. No, we need to learn first that ghiba is haram and it's a major sin. And the Quran was revealed. أَيُحِبُّ أَحَدُكُمْ أَن يَأْكُلَ لَحْمَ أَخِيهِ مَيْتًا فَكَرِهْتُمُوهُ. Would one of you would love to eat the flesh of his brother when he's dead? What that human being will be called in this life. If he goes to a dead body and he takes a piece of the flesh and he eats it. The ayah does not exaggerate. This is exactly what happens when you backbite, when you mention your brother in his absence with something that he dislikes. And there's the narration where the Prophet ﷺ, to make it short, when he mentioned to two of the companions, one said about the servant that he overslept. He said, his head is heavy, he sleeps too much. The Prophet ﷺ, when he saw them coming, he said, I see his flesh between your teeth. And the Prophet ﷺ does not lie. He's not saying something as, I see his flesh. No. He's seeing, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals to him. So this is exactly what's happening as a result of al-ghiba or backbiting. So it's not something to be taken lightly. And this is not just to be mentioned in a reminder, by the way. This is just a reminder, right? We have a duty that we have to learn, ilm, mandatory for us to learn, because there are nusus, texts that talks about, as one aspect, what al-ghiba is. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. There are exceptions, and it's not considered to be ghiba. As one example, even though there are 6 or so as they mentioned, if someone comes and asks you, so and so wants to marry my daughter, what do you know about that individual? You know him, you pray with him, you deal with him, transactions, money. He's asking you about the bad things, not the good things. Right? If you say the good things, mashallah, everybody has good things. But he wants to know what's bad in him. So then it becomes a manna and a responsibility that you have to expose that brother. Not expose his previous sins, if he repented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from it, but now of what you know of him, that he's greedy, he gets angry and he starts, saying crazy stuff. You have to say what is bad about him. And this is amana, this is a trust. You're not lying, of course, it's not permissible to lie. You're not backbiting, you're not exceeding the limits. So that's why it's ilm. It's not left to our own desires. It's knowledge for us to learn. And that's why we need to take the time to learn these matters. And I would end with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when he said, and he talked about the rights of the Muslims, and there are many different narrations to it. when he said that حق المسلم على المسلم six rights of the Muslim. This is the physical part. This is the easy part, right? It's supposed to be that way. And when he was asked عليه الصلاة والسلام, he said إذا لقيته فسلم عليه. Every time you meet him, you give him salam. The Sahaba radiallahu anhum, which is a very, not unique to them, this is how the deen of Islam should be. If they say something, their hearts are upon it. What is the individual at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that his heart is one thing and his tongue is in a different thing? They call him what? Hypocrite, right? So whenever they would say salam, they mean it. So what does a salam means? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. You're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make that brother in state of peace and security in this life and in the hereafter. So when you say assalamu alaikum, that's sufficient. If you say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be upon you. That's why if he initiated the salam, his rights is to be replied at least with exactly the same words that he said, but you need to be generous and do more, because he showed this act of generosity to you. So you say wa alaykum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and the blessings from Allah. And one simple thing, if we mean this in our hearts, in that simple act that we would see our brothers every day, how many times in the salah, if we focus and have this conscious, every time we see salam, we mean it from our hearts, our life will be completely different. That sincerity, that I'm really sincerely asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect you, to make you safe. Even if you did this and this to me, this is your right. This is not a recommended matter, this is haqq. But we need to do it the way it ought to be. So very briefly, إِذَا لَقِيتَهُ فَسَلِّمْ عَلَيْهِ. If I forget, maybe somebody might remind me, inshallah. وَإِذَا دعيت أو إذا دعاك فأجبه. If he invites you for a walima or so, then accept the invitation. And the one that is wajib to accept is the walima of marriage. If he invites you, then you have to go, unless you have a dire need or excuse. That's no problem, inshallah ta'ala. So this is one of the rights of the believers, and because the believers are generous, so if they invite and they prepared food and so on, they want to honor themselves and honor others by doing so, then accept that, as long as there's no sins. A third one, وَإِذَا اسْتَنصَحَكَ فَانصَحْ لَهُ. If he asks you for nasiha, then give him the nasiha. The ulama, they say this is wajib. This is an obligatory thing. If someone asks you for an advice, you have to give him an advice. And this is a subject by itself. Who's the ones that we need to seek advice from? And you won't go wrong if you give the nasiha for the taqwa of Allah. Have the fear of Allah, be obedient to Allah. And then if you are an expert in something, he wants to open a business and you're expert in this, don't be greedy. Give him the advice, but with the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on. So وَإِذَا اسْتَنصَحَكَ فَانصَحْ وَإِذَا مَرِضَ فَعُدْهُ. And if he becomes sick, then you visit him. And this is fardu kifaya. If in a community a Muslim is sick, and no one else, no one whatsoever visit him, the community are in fault. But how would people know one another if they don't go to the masjid? This is how the masjid is supposed to be the initiating point of all things. Not everyone is isolated in their own homes. That's why the masajid, and coming to the masajid, where we start from the masajid to learn and to act and so on. And how many, because of the time, we said? Okay, mashallah. So again, let's say it again. إذا لقيته فسلم عليه. If you meet him, then say salam to him. وإذا دعاك فأجبه. If he invites you, then respond and accept his da'wah. And there's ahkam, by the way, to all these things. وإذا استنصحك فانصح له. If he asks you for nasiha, then be concerned and be sincere in your nasiha to him. وإذا مرض فعده. And if he's sick, then visit him. And there's one before that. وَإِذَا مَرِضَ فَعُدْهُ. So this is, and there is also إِذَا مَرِضَ فَعُدْهُ وَإِذَا مَاتَ. If he dies, then فَشَيْعُ, that means you go to the janazah of him. You walk in his janazah if he dies. And there are other rights that are observed. But these are right. So what is meant by this is these are the physical aspect of things which is supposed to be the easier one. And the foundation of that is what's in the hearts and also in our speech. And to observe that, having the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and understanding that this ummah is one. This aqd, this covenant between each and every one of us. And this is where the subject of al-wala wal-bara and the dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it doesn't have to be that everybody is, mashallah, perfect iman and good and obedient to Allah. If it's someone is good, mashallah. If someone is not good, he has right upon us to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for their guidance, to advise them, to enjoin good, to forbid the evil, to have the concern towards them, right? And to be there for one another. We're living at times where, as we know how sins are. So as the ulama, they say we need to be more gentle than any other time. We need to be gentle with one another. There's so many things that is against those who want to be steadfast upon the deen of Allah. So to observe these meanings, to have that concern, to have the love for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's part of our deen. This is the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In Jumu'ah, I mentioned an incident that I love this incident every time I narrate or mention it, even though it's not the most, the greatest ones, but it shows how the hearts of the companions were so pure towards one another that they don't forget even the act of kindness at all times. We don't forget the acts of the opposite, right? The acts of ignorance. You always remember that for your brother, but they were the opposite. So if you were in Salatul Jum'ah, where Ka'b ibn Malik radiallahu anh, when he was old in age and he lost his eyesight, and he every time he would go for Jum'ah, his son would take him to Salatul Jum'ah in Medina. Every time in Jum'ah, he would hear him making dua to one of the companions, As'ad ibn Zurara radiallahu anhu. He would make dua for him every day of Jum'ah when he's going for Salatul Jum'ah. So his son asked him, why every Jum'ah you make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for him? He says, كان أول من جمع بنا في المدينة. He was the first one to establish Salatul Jum'ah in Medina. And we were 40. So since then, just one Salat Jum'ah, he still remember this favor that this brother did for them. And he would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala every time he goes for Jum'ah. What level of, as they call it, wafa, what level of faithfulness that these individuals they had, it's all of because of the iman in the hearts. When the heart is pure with the iman and the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then this faithfulness comes in place. And that's why, by the way, and as the ulama they say, we all came from many different backgrounds. If you had someone, even when you were a child, someone that did a small favor to you, give you a piece of candy, for example, or a neighbor that was kind to you, or a teacher that taught you something, right? And then it's after years you have no idea what that person is. It's part of the deen that to have this husn al-ahd is to maybe call him, maybe to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for him, ask about him. If he died, his heirs, his sons, do they need anything? This is a practice that it's been in the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, but we start imitating others. It's not like to bother them, it's to have this type of thing as part of the deen. This is not something extra. This is part of our deen. The Prophet ﷺ said to Aisha radiallahu anha, and the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, when Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, when the Hala, the sister of Khadija radiallahu anha, she came to visit them. The Prophet ﷺ heard the voice of Hala saying Assalamu alaikum or so. So he says, Hala Hala. He was happy to have Hala, the sister of Khadija, to visit them. Her voice was similar to the voice of Khadija. So it reminded him of Khadija radiallahu anha, and he honored her and so on. So Aisha radiallahu anha, she was surprised. And she asked the Prophet ﷺ, why all of this generosity? So he mentioned to her the statement. He said, Ya Aisha, inna husn al-ahdi min al-iman. Husn al-ahd from al-iman, relating it to the core of the religion. Al-iman, what's husn al-ahd? Husn al-ahd is the goodness of the covenant. If there was any relationship, you had a moment of goodness, part of al-iman is that you honor this for the rest of your life. So, where is this in our life? Where is these means that we take to make sure? And this is work to be done, yes. We need to start to remember those who did things for us so that we show all kinds of and acts of kindness. And the least we can do is the dua. This is one of the rights of the Muslims. We make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all of those who are suffering, and Muslims in Gaza, Sudan, everywhere, right? But also the individuals in one's life that you know, those who passed away, those who are still alive. We have lots of things to be done. And this is something, and also the ones that you interact with in the masjid, right? Those who you pray with, to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for them, for their guidance, for their steadfastness, for the goodness of this life and the hereafter. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who are steadfast upon the deen of Allah, and to be among those who are gathered in the day of Al-Qiyamah with the Prophet ﷺ, where those who love one another for the sake of Allah, they are gathered in pulpits and things of light and pearl, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم ربنا بحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خير.